Very good. Well, good morning. I hope the weather's better in Spain than it is here in England at the moment, where it's pouring with rain. I'm sure you've got bright sunshine. Well, may I extend a great welcome to you. And many's the occasion where I've joined in on similar occasions with New Direction. So it's a great pleasure for me to talk to you this morning. If you lose sound or anything like that, please put your hands up and let me see, because I'm not hearing you so clearly, but I hope you can hear me okay. I'm going to say a few words about the recent summit meetings and then touch on some particular issues. I want to touch on, well, the EU defense role, say something about Germany, say something about migration, say something about Turkey. These are the sort of topics I just want to touch on. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then I hope I can respond to your questions. Of course, foremost in all our minds, and I see you sitting there with your masks on still, is the COVID pandemic and rekindling our dormant economies. But at the same time, the security environment has become more complex and unpredictable than ever before. We've got a very aggressive and assertive Russia, in spite of all the smiles in Geneva. We have more brutal forms of terrorism. We have increasing cyber and hybrid threats, and an accelerating pace of technological development. And crucially, China's rise fundamentally shifts the balance of power, and both Russia and China have been dismissive and contemptuous of the long-standing international rules-based order. So this is the sort of context that we're looking at things in. There's obviously a deep and long-term concern about the effects of climate change, and also the opening of new domains for potential conflicts, such as the polar regions. More talk about the Arctic and indeed the Antarctic, and space, of course, which has taken on new significance. And meanwhile, I would say that our own generally prosperous, law-abiding and peaceful democratic societies are afflicted by new divisions, largely imported, certainly inflamed by our external adversaries. And just as we protect minorities within our own societies, we must not ignore the views of the mainstream majority of our people. Otherwise, they'll turn to the extremes. And we've seen some examples of that. Social media and instant reporting from across the planet amplify grievance and anxiety in all our societies. I don't want to depress you. Greater challenges have been overcome over the centuries. I have great confidence in mankind's ability to overcome adversity. And I suggest that individual anxiety does more damage quite often than the threat itself. But we all need to understand the threats to our societies, and all of us, young and old, should be prepared to take a stand on behalf of our liberal free market democracies for freedom, in fact. So our governments do respond to the challenges, but sometimes they take longer than they should to get it right. Well, it couldn't be a better time to be talking about security issues. We've had a whole week of international summits. We had the G7 summit in England, of course, the usual G7 countries represented, but also partly for some of the meetings, we had Australia, India, South Africa, and South Korea represented there. Then there was the NATO summit in Brussels last Monday, an US-EU summit also in Brussels, and finally the meeting of the American and Russian presidents in Geneva. So it's been a busy week of security-related international conferences. The one common factor in all these meetings has been the presence of the President of the United States. I would say the positive presence of the President of the United States. This underlines the centrality of the United States to the European and global economy, to its security, and to its defense. You might ask, by the way, what's the point of all these very expensive and disruptive, somewhat theatrical meetings? They all originated, of course, as very informal meetings. I think the first G7, which then G6 summit, took place back in 1975. The first NATO summit took place in 1957. They tended to be more informal then, but as the years have gone on, they've become more structured, more bureaucratic, and with a lot of preceding meetings in which obviously the officials are preparing the agenda. Not surprisingly, for each of these meetings, you end up with a 30-page communique. And not surprisingly, very few people bother to read the communiques, many of which were written weeks in advance, if not months in advance. And they get just the final sort of titillation right at the end. I think there's a case for a return to informality, although officials will hate this because it means they don't have control of the agenda and they're not present, of course. Nevertheless, the summits, I think, are very important. The theatre itself is important. It should demonstrate, these summits should demonstrate the strength, the determination and cohesiveness of the Western countries in particular, of the democracies. They should reassure our own citizens that we're talking to one another, that we're good friends. It should demonstrate the personal bonding between our leaders. And of course, it's an opportunity for many new leaders to meet their colleagues. I would also emphasize the importance of the meetings that take place in the margins of these summits, the bilateral meetings, which are often very productive. And most important at this time, I think, America is seen once again to confirm the strength of its transatlantic commitment and underlining its leadership role in cooperation with allies. So they do have a very important point. So my focus this morning is on security issues. What actually came out of the NATO summit, for example? Well, of course, they endorsed the need to spend more on defense and to spend it well. That's been a prevalent theme over the last 4 or 5 years. Interestingly, the key article of the NATO treaty, Article 5, remember that is the article where an attack on one ally is an attack on all. This is most important. This was originally seen as a sort of an armed conventional attack. Interestingly, this summit has extended the scope of Article 5 to include both hybrid and cyber attack. Now, of course, this isn't automatic, a response to such attacks, but it does mean the possibility of an Article 5 response to a cyber attack. For example, we've also seen strengthened engagement between NATO and the beyond the Euro-Atlantic area. In other words, allies in Asia and elsewhere. So we won't be extending the treaty, but it does mean that we will be working more closely with those allies. And also, following the reflection group, which the Secretary General of NATO had set in being, there will be a new strategic concept that underpins everything NATO does, which will be developed in time for the next summit in 2022. Thoughts, of course, were focused on Russia and China, but perhaps I'd just mention a couple of things that weren't really discussed at the summit. And the first of these, very briefly, is the role of the EU in this sort of area. In the small world in which we live, you might argue that the defense of the democracies is indivisible. We must be consistent and coherent in our dealings with the autocracies. And we must be aware that they do try to create divisions among us. So we know that Russia, for example, wants to promote internal discontent in our countries. Its long-standing strategic objectives are not only to rebuild the old Soviet Union in some form, but to neutralize Germany, separate Europe and America, and gradually erode the NATO alliance at its most vulnerable periphery. And it also wants respect and a seat at the top table. We know China wishes to rewrite the international rules to expand its sphere of influence and use its resources as a sort of wedge to persuade governments in Asia and Africa and beyond to look to China rather than to the West for their support. But what about the EU? I'm not talking about the member states of the European Union. I'm talking about the EU as an organization, gradually taking more and more sovereign powers from its members in order to create a federal European state. This is the paramount aim of the European Union. And in the security field, in my opinion, it has never been about creating more military capability, although it might be dressed up that way. It is in order to strengthen European political integration. We don't see the EU creating any additional military capabilities as such. We do see the EU talking increasingly about so-called strategic autonomy. By definition, this means removing United States influence and creating another center of decision-making, the very opposite to the confirmation just 4 days ago in Brussels that NATO was the forum for security decisions. And it also plays, I believe, to the Russian agenda of separating Europe and its transatlantic allies. This is the effect of what is happening. It is a diversion and a distraction, and I've consistently opposed EU defense policy precisely for that reason over many years. Why do other governments go along with what is essentially a French agenda? Why include a paragraph in the NATO summit communique applauding EU defense efforts? Just one paragraph out of 79, I should point out. I suppose the short answer is that such a paragraph has been there for years at the insistence of France and Germany, and that 22 out of 30 NATO members are also EU members. And so they go along with this. Some would say it's meaningless. I would argue it's a dangerous encouragement and distraction when we should all be focused on strengthening the alliance that matters, which is NATO. By the way, if we look at NATO's forward presence in Eastern Europe, 3 out of the 4 battle groups which are deployed forward in the Baltic states and in Poland are led by non-EU allies. And given the fact that the defense of Europe depends on the rapid reinforcement by the United States and the United Kingdom, the two strongest military powers, why is the EU making such a meal out of military mobility across Europe? Of course, a particular problem, and we've seen this after Brexit, is how do we embrace the military intelligence and security power of the United Kingdom, the foremost in Europe, by the way. At the same time, the EU treats the United Kingdom as some sort of alien because it has rejected the EU desire to pursue political integration. And I have to say, France has been poisonous in this regard and highly destructive in the post-Brexit negotiations, which is no basis for confidence and trust between allies. And then bizarrely, the United Kingdom and France have a bilateral defense treaty. And doubly bizarrely, the French have also, although they're the prime enthusiasts for European defense policy, they're also creating a thing called the European Intervention Initiative, which is outside the EU structures, which involves many EU countries, but also, crucially, the United Kingdom. So there are a lot of ambiguities and contradictions in all this. Something we can discuss perhaps. Let me say a word or two about Germany. Obviously, Germany is Europe's most populous and richest country, but she doesn't pull her weight in security terms. She says she's going to do more. Why is this? I believe there are a number of factors. The burden of guilt from the immediate past, and stemming from this, the aversion of the German people to any form of what they see as militarism, the reluctance of left-wing coalition partners to use military capabilities for other than soft humanitarian type operations. And I think also there's been a sort of pervasive anti-Americanism. We see this in a number of countries, but particularly among younger people. But generally the governing classes in Germany and elsewhere don't share that view. They're strongly supportive of NATO in spite of their endorsement of EU defense policy. They've convinced themselves perhaps that EU defense policy will somehow complement and reinforce NATO, whereas clearly that's not its purpose. Now, we should also be aware, by the way, that attitudes can change under different governments. So in the case of Germany, it's worth just having in the back of your mind, what would happen if the Green Party in Germany, which of course is a very left-wing party, would become a coalition partner in a future German government. We have German elections in September. Some have even talked about a Green Chancellor. I think that's highly unlikely, but there is a possibility of the Greens being in a coalition. What impact would that have on already weak attachment to security policy in Germany? I want to say a word or two very briefly about migration, because I believe this has enormous security consequences, and I think it's something which has not been properly discussed. In fact, we're even very reluctant to mention the very topic. Of course, all of us welcome many, many migrants that have come to our countries and played an enormously constructive role. I welcome them and I admire the contribution they've made, particularly in my own country. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about mass uncontrolled immigration. mass uncontrolled migration. You see this where you're sitting at the moment in Spain. In the past 6 years, some 2 million people have crossed into Europe over the Mediterranean. Contrary to popular opinion, they're not all fleeing conflict. This year, for example, the largest sending country is Bangladesh. And large numbers have come from other countries, such as Côte d'Ivoire, Eritrea, and countries such as that. We haven't yet found a way of properly controlling this flow of migration or properly integrating people from very different cultures into our societies. And I think this is the nub of the problem. And the other thing that we see is that people want to leave, we can all understand this, oppressive regimes. They want to come to our free, more prosperous countries. But when they arrive, very rapidly, they find themselves in the grip of the same sorts of people that they tried to leave behind. And often in more extreme form, set up in our own countries. And I think this is a serious problem. Our internal cohesion as countries is weakened. Our security is threatened. Our borders are shown to be permeable. And I think confidence in our governments and institutions is weakened. Let me also now say a word or two, because it's related to that topic in many people's minds on the subject of Turkey. I find Turkey endlessly fascinating. There's no more divisive topic when we're within a European audience than talking about Turkey. We've always found this within our own ECR group, even in the parliament. Just remember that Turkey is a key Western ally. It's a long-term NATO member. Yet again, at this summit, there's been an endorsement of the role that Turkey plays. It sits in a key geostrategic location. But I think all this is sometimes blurred in people's minds by the thoughts of mass migration from Turkey. And it is true that President Erdogan sometimes talks in ways which people find not entirely acceptable. He's very religiously motivated. Some would say that he's used the EU accession process to suppress the power of the military and, in the name of human rights, to enhance the visible position of Islam across society and government. And we'd always held out the hope that Turkey would actually be a model of democratic Islam that would show other countries how you can both be Muslim and indeed democratic. But that seems to have weakened a little bit in recent months. But some see Turkey's drift as a reaction to our own actions and our own unreliability as allies. We didn't take notice of Turkey's warnings about the 2003 Iraq war. We underappreciate Turkey's contribution to NATO operations, not least in places like Afghanistan. We don't really notice the great humanitarian operations that the Turks have done, not just concerning Syrian refugees, but in other parts of the world as well. And of course, the rebuff by the European Union when the door was closed in their face, although Turkey remains an official candidate to join the European Union. Failure to support Turkey in terms of northern Cyprus, and the most damaging personal insult as far as Erdogan was concerned is the failure of Western leaders to offer immediate support after that military coup, which took place in July 2016. So all these reasons, and there are others, why the Turks themselves are not too happy. And then, not surprisingly, they started to look elsewhere for support. And by looking elsewhere, of course, they've created further suspicions in the West. So this is a very difficult quandary. All I would say is that, in my belief, Turkey is not a lost cause, not by any means. We need to re-establish trust and confidence, mutual trust and confidence. Remember that even President Erdogan is not going to be there forever. And in any case, he has shown the willingness to be flexible when necessary. So I think we need to ensure that we keep Turkey on board. I think it's very important strategically for the West. But of course, we need to keep our eyes on the real enemies, which are Russia, Iran, and possibly China, as well as, of course, as international terrorism. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, let me just say, we can't with any accuracy foresee developments in the next 10 years, let alone the next 30 years, which is, of course, the life expectancy of most major weapon systems, which we are developing and bringing into service at the moment. We face a serious threat from technologically advanced, and in the case of China, economically powerful autocracies, which have never had any real concern for the lives of their own people. I would suggest that democracies have become very soft, absorbed with social welfare problems, and divided now, and I see this in my own country, by sort of self-invented identity politics and wokeism, which are being exploited by our adversaries. And I'm concerned that young people in particular, in all our countries, feel little attachment to our democracies. I'm not sure they realize that our democracy needs to be defended. They've got little interest in our armed forces or the other instruments of the state which help defend our freedoms. I admire the fact that so many young people are very internationalists. They're concerned about great issues like climate change and the future of the planet, and have very many positive humanitarian instincts. But unfortunately, these instincts are not shared by the autocracies. We need a mailed fist under our velvet glove. And not just Britain and America, but the democracies, all of them, should be prepared to act when threatened, if necessary, through coalitions of the willing. So as the democracies, I believe we need to improve our antennae, understand better what's going on, enhance confidence in ourselves. I often say, others think better of us than we think of ourselves. Recognize our differences, but come together where it matters, and strengthen resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, freedom is hard won and very easily lost. Thank you for your attention. I welcome any questions that you might have.
Dear Geoffrey, thank you very much for this very good overview. I hope you can hear me.
I can.
Perfect. I would like to ask you a question about intelligence services. We know that in the EU, the intelligence services were much more relying on the British one. We know that the EU officials were very afraid about that cooperation after the Brexit. How do you see the intelligence services in the EU after the Brexit and the cooperation?
I can hear you, but I'm not hearing you very clearly, I have to say.
Okay. So I will start it.
Just give me the point of your question.
Yeah, the point is the cooperation between UK and the EU in terms of intelligence services.
Right. Well, there are many forums for intelligence sharing. Don't forget, we have very close bilateral relationships with many European countries. Again, curiously, France, Germany, Spain, indeed, Belgium, Netherlands, many other European countries where we have very close bilateral intelligence links and close operational links as well. So that goes on all the time. The problem often comes when we try to involve an institution like the EU in these arrangements. So a particular bone of contention has been the access to what I would call police and security data, particularly given what I've mentioned about the problems of migration, where frankly, quite often we do not know who's really coming into our countries. And so one of the concerns about Brexit was that linkage would be lost. I'm confident, by the way, that the bilateral links continue. I think work still has to be done about how the United Kingdom and the EU are going to continue to share that sort of security data on a more rapid basis. Because what's important is not what you do in a week's time, but probably that officer at the border who's faced with a person and he needs to know who this person is and what is known about him, if anything. So that's an area that I think still has to be worked on. We had been confident that this would all be easily resolved, but we see in every area dealing with the EU that difficulties are put up. And by the way, the EU gets as much out of us on that security data as we do with them. And just one final point on the question of intelligence sharing. Of course, the more widely you share intelligence, the leakier it becomes. So you have to be extremely careful how you share intelligence, which I come back again to, bilateral relationships and the confidence we have in each other's agencies and their ability to protect the often very sensitive information that we're dealing with.
Thank you very much. In Hungary, about the migration crisis, the state policy was that we should not bring the problem to Europe, but solve the problem where it began. If we look back to 2015, the past years we took in 2 million immigrants, which was really difficult for Europe to deal with them. But if we take a look to the demography of Africa, we can see that it will be doubled in the forthcoming years. So my question is that obviously the immigration or the willingness of immigration will increase in the direction of Europe from African countries. How can this problem solved there?
Yeah, okay. When I was still an MEP, not so long ago, I actually visited Calabria and saw the migration handling centers that the Italians had established, and talked to the Italian authorities at great length about all this. I mean, the fact is that some 32,000 people have already crossed the Mediterranean since January. We see the primary routes, of course, are to Italy and then to Spain, to a lesser extent to Greece, with a few going to Cyprus and to Malta. But it's Spain and Italy which are the ones that are most affected by this. I think the problem is what I call the magnet of the democracies. People know that once they set foot on European territory, they're in. And it's extremely difficult then for people to be removed. We have the farce of our warships often ferrying people from one side of the Mediterranean to the other, because of course we can't see people drowning trying to make these crossings. So it needs to be stopped before people get away from the coasts. And that means you have to intensify the arrangements with the North African coastal countries. And Libya in particular is still a turbulent country, but there's no reason why more shouldn't be done by Tunisia. And by the way, a significant number are from Tunisia. But most importantly, there are things we can do ourselves. I believe that until we review the application of the international conventions, such as the Refugee Convention and the Conventions on Human Rights, until we review them in the context of our times, we are never going to get on this, on top of this problem. Because that is what the lawyers in all of our countries immediately seize on in order for people to be allowed to remain. And so if people know once they get across the Mediterranean, they're in, and we're not going to be able to remove them, that's an enormous incentive. I think also access to our own welfare systems, access to so many other benefits in our own countries, access to citizenship, all of these things need to be reviewed. In other words, we need to turn off the magnet, and we need stronger pressure on the sending coastal countries, because most of the people that are coming are not coming from areas of conflict. It is not true to say that the majority of people coming across the Mediterranean are fleeing the conflict in Syria, for example. It is just not true. The figures are there for everyone to see. People are coming from, predominantly at the moment, from Bangladesh, but also from Côte d'Ivoire, Eritrea, Somalia, Afghanistan, Iran, and further afield, Vietnam and beyond. We now have this problem in Britain. We didn't have it before. We now have it. Last year, some 8,000 people crossed the Channel. Frankly, the French aren't doing enough about it. We pay them millions. These people have traveled all through Europe. They cluster on the Channel coast, and then they make their way across. Actually, this has been going on for 20 years, but people have only just noticed because they've been coming across very blatantly in small boats. I think a lot of it is in our own hands. We need to turn off the magnet. I don't see any willingness, particularly in the EU. Whenever one talks about these things, you faced a torrent of abuse. How dare we even discuss these things in this way? But frankly, until we do, I think this will be a continuing problem. And one of the real problems will be that our own mainstream society will become increasingly discontent with this situation. Thank you.
So I have two questions. One is, what can we do with Muslim communities that in many cases are auto-referential or are like closed and do not try to be in our countries um, as one of us, as a national, as a Spaniard or British. And the other one is, do you believe that Islam is compatible with democracy?
Do I think what is compatible with democracy?
Islam.
Islam. Oh, yes. I've actually run many conferences on this topic in the European Parliament, and I've had many Muslim speakers who've come along to talk about these things. What they will say is, just to address your last point, what they will say is that what is talked about is a particularly extreme version of Islam, that it is a corruption of Islam that feeds the mind of so many of the extremists. And that if people really saw that Islam was a religion of peace, so that is the short answer to that. There is absolutely no reason why Islam and democracy should not go together. In terms of the integration of large numbers of people in our own societies, coming from countries, most of which are Muslim. I mean, you have to ask yourself, why is it Muslim countries that all people want to escape from? And I do make the point again, and I think this is an important point, that when they get to our country, so many of those people want to find the freedoms of our society. And of course, what happens to them? They then are placed in communities where the extremists have control, very often, and where the same pressures. So to give you an example, if you have a young man, a British Muslim, a British person of, let's say, Bangladeshi origin or Pakistani origin, and he goes back then to his country of origin to find a bride. And he'll find a young woman. It'll be probably some family deal that's been done there. She will be brought to England. She probably doesn't speak British English. She has obviously absolutely no idea whatsoever about British culture. All she knows is the role of a woman in the society that she's left. And that is the role she's then expected in so many cases to continue. And we have children from those backgrounds who go to schools where every other child in that school is of the same background, and even some of the teachers are. So, of course, we are free countries. We want people to be able to practice their religion, and we want them to be proud of some of their cultural traditions. But I believe firmly that people will not just be integrated, but they must be assimilated into our societies. Of course, often we're not good examples. I mean, if I was a Muslim father and I came to some parts of my own country and I saw the way some young people behave, and I'd say to myself, I don't want my children behaving in that way. I can understand that in some ways. So maybe we've got to do a bit better ourselves. But I think we have a real problem of integration in some areas. That's not to say that we don't have so many people of an immigrant background who've done brilliantly in our countries. I mean, look at the British government today. I mean, three or four of our top ministers in the British government are of that background. Our Home Secretary, our Interior Minister, is of Indian origin, Hindu, admittedly. And there are many others as well. So yes, many are doing extremely well. Some of our greatest entrepreneurs come from those backgrounds. But they're not the ones we're talking about. We're talking about those now who are lost, if you like, in their own almost ghetto-like communities, where the only influences on them come from these particular people that they thought they were leaving behind. When I talk to Arab leaders about these things, they look at me with astonishment, because they say, well, we control our imams. We control what sermons they're allowed to give in the mosque. Why don't you do the same? They speak in our local language. Why don't you do the same? So I believe we should have, the imams should be trained in our own countries. I believe that increasingly they should address their congregation in the English language. All these sorts of things. But we are very laissez-faire. We are very libertarian in terms of our attitude to this, and I think it's very unhealthy, and it will create growing problems for the future.
Can you please say a few words about what is happening in the South China Sea, and what should be the reaction of the EU and the UK? Thank you.
Well, China is very conscious of her sovereignty and of her regional power. All the time, she has tried to push the bounds of the areas that she controls. And what we've seen is that there are any number of examples of what were previously remote atolls, remote just rocks or small islands in the South China Sea, whose sovereignty is sometimes disputed, perhaps with the Philippines, perhaps with Taiwan, perhaps with Japan, perhaps with a number of other countries, where China has established military facilities, and it's happened almost overnight. Remarkable, the speed with which very sophisticated military facilities have been put up in those areas, turning them into sort of little fortresses. We continue to stand by the law of the sea and the international rules on territorial sovereignty, but the law of the sea in particular, which is why Western ships and ships from other countries in East Asia make a point of sailing in international waters, even in those areas which China claims sovereignty over. So we must continue to do that. The most difficult area, of course, is somewhere like Taiwan, which, of course, one country, two systems. Even Taiwan recognizes, yes, we're within the Chinese orbit. We are, however, a separate country, an autonomous state. China doesn't recognize that. It is potentially one of the most dangerous trigger points for future conflict. But I think what we have to do is have a consistent approach to how we deal with a country like China. On the one hand, we need China because when we address problems like climate change, we need Chinese cooperation. All our efforts are really brought to nothing unless the Chinese also cooperate. When we talk about the health of our oceans, we need China to cooperate. In terms of outer space and the whole space domain, we need China's cooperation. So, at the one hand, we need cooperation. On the other hand, it must be made very clear to China that we all stand by the internationally rules-based laws. China, of course, rejects these. She says that many of these were laws made by others in a moment of our weakness. And so they reject them. We must make it very clear. This is the basis on which a peaceful world order has persisted over many years. The difficulty is, and I described it as the Chinese wedge effect. This is a very clear aspect of Chinese attitudes to other countries, where they will try to offer them very good financial deals, investment, and all of that, maybe new technology very cheaply, but in return they want something. We see this even, by the way, in Europe. When we look at in Greece, the Piraeus dock area there, if we look at the train system between southern Greece and Italy and beyond, if we look at many of these areas, there's a lot of Chinese investment there. I think you'd be surprised if you look at the areas where Chinese are very, very involved. This affects the attitude of governments. It weakens the resolve of our governments to take a strong position, a united position. So I think really what I'm saying is we have to recognize the reality of China. We need to try and develop friendly relations. We need to harness the strengths of China for good purposes, but we must be very clear where we draw a line, and we must be united in that approach.
Are there any other questions? Okay, so I think this is it. Thank you very much, Geoffrey, for your presentation.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. Nice to talk to you all. I wish you all every success and enjoy Madrid.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Bye.